Happy Friday, game changers. I so trust that your Thanksgiving celebration, however you celebrate it, reminded you of the goodness of God and that the blessings always outweigh the challenges and the struggles and the difficulties. And when we keep that perspective about life, we navigate life so much more smoothly. So I had an amazing Thanksgiving. I celebrated and was reminded continuously of God's goodness. And I watched a lot of football. So I promised you earlier this week that I would come on and I would walk you through one of the lessons for level 1 so that you would have a sense of how I teach it. I want this to be a demonstration. I want you to see the nuances that I bring to this so that I walk away having opened the youth up, poured something inside of them to process, and then sent them away to make a choice about what they do with what I just gave them. So the first level, which was the Super Sunday launch, level 1 was don't get it twisted. And there are two things that I want the youth to take away from this level. Remember, there's more material than we will ever be able to cover in a 5-week session. However, depending on how you decide to do it, you can go deeper and you can go slower. But the two most important lessons for this first level are, number 1, I want them to grasp the concept that life is just like a video game. And I don't know many youth these days that are not very familiar with video games. So that's the first concept. And then the second concept question that I want them to process is, who are they? And notice I said process, because everything that I'm doing is not about just imparting information. What I'm doing is allowing them an opportunity to open up, consider some information, some truths that I'm sharing, and then process it. So that's the ultimate objective. Not that I just give them information, but I want them to process it. And I want them to process it in a group with other youth. And I want to be the facilitator that impacts the way they process it. So the first lesson for level 1 that I start with is life really is just like video games. And so here's how I start. I want to engage them. I want to hook them into the discussion. I don't want them just sitting there being quiet. I want them engaged. So I start with my GOATs, the greatest of all time video game players, because they've all had successes. They've all achieved accomplishments that they're excited and pleased about. So I get them to talk about their favorite games and their favorite achievements in their favorite games. And that's just the beginning of the engagement. That's just the beginning of the hooking them in. And depending on the size of the group, will determine how many people get to share. But that also sets the tone for who my sharers are. So I can know who my go-to people are, and I can know who I have to calm down a little bit so that other people will have an opportunity to share. So initially, I want to hear their success stories, the greatest of all time video game players and what they've achieved. And then I do what I call a pop quiz. I love to throw pop quizzes at our youth because they're used to pop quizzes in school. So my first pop quiz under the heading of life is just like a video game, the first pop quiz is, if your life were a video game, what would you name it? If their life were a video game, what would the name of their video game be? And it's so interesting to watch them process that and come up with the answers to that question about their lives in terms of it being a video game. One of my favorite answers from a young person was, never a dull moment. And you can imagine what was going through that young person's head when they said their video game would be called Never a Dull Moment. So again, depending on the size of the group, I allowed the youth to share what they would name their video game about their life and why. And it's fun because they are not they're not intimidated to imagine. They're not intimidated to think about, what does my life look like and how would I describe it as a video game? So after we have some discussion about that, then we begin to think about how do video games and life really compare? And I want them to just look at that. What are the comparisons between life and video games? And I don't give them the answers. I just want them to start brainstorming. And so much of this process is not about me giving them answers. It's not about me lecturing. It's about them processing and thinking through my questions to discuss them. So as we dive into the comparisons, of course, I want them to think about there are players in video games, and players create characters, and the characters face challenges, whatever those challenges they may look like, depending on the nature of the game. And there is someone who created, there's a mastermind behind the video game, the expert I call that person. And I want them to recognize that in life, there also is a sovereign authority expert mastermind. And I draw the parallels between who they are in the video game as a player, but who they are in life as a character that was created by God to play the game of life. And we dive into that. What does that mean? And how did God make those decisions? And does God make mistakes? And was I created the way God wanted me to be? Or was I an oops? And we just dive into that a little bit from the perspective of them understanding that life is like a video game. And as they are allowed to create their characters in their video games, they create the characters the way they want them to be, with the skills and the abilities and the physical attributes and the intellectual abilities. Just like God created each of us the way He wanted us to be, with characteristics, physical, mental, emotional, skills, and abilities. And just like we don't mess up with our characters, God didn't mess up with us. So I want them to really begin to appreciate the fact that God, the sovereign mastermind expert of life, created us the way He wanted us to be, and we don't have to question or doubt that He went, oops, my bad, I made a mistake. So then after we get that concept down, then I transition into the notion of, well, what does it take to win? How do you achieve success? How do you move from one level to the next? How do you score points? How do you ultimately perhaps end up on the leaderboard? And I want them to really begin to ask themselves, what does it take? How have I been able to achieve what I've achieved? And we discuss that. And we make a list of those kinds of attributes, abilities, accomplishments that are necessary to be successful in video games and life. And then at the end of it, I do give them a list. I give them a list of 10 qualities, characteristics, traits that are necessary in both life and video games. And I ask them to rank order them in terms of how important do they think they are in order to be successful in video games or life. And some of the items on the list include knowledge, teamwork, commitment, persistence, voice, etc., etc. And I want them to rank order them. I don't want them to just look at the list, but I want them to ask themselves how important are each of these characteristics to them about being successful. And then as the discussion evolves, I want them to hear how others in the group rank ordered the same criteria. Not to determine who's right or who's wrong, but just to determine how people look at it differently, and to have a dialogue where each of them shares particularly about why was their number one on their list, because that determines how they look at playing the games and playing life. And again, it's not about right or wrong. It's simply about how do you make those kinds of decisions? And how do you rank order the skills and the attributes that are necessary to be successful? So that's the first exercise. And this is a handout. And I give them the handout and I walk them through it step by step, because again, I'm not lecturing. I am not just spewing information at them. I'm wanting them to process, and I'm wanting them to analyze the information that we are discussing. So that's the how life and video games are similar. Now, the second exercise, and this is one of my most favorite, is the exercise called Who Are You? Because when you think about being successful in video games or life, you got to come from a place of knowing who you are. If you're going to be successful, you've got to recognize perhaps that you have weaknesses that you need to overcome if you want to be successful. But often with youth, it's quite the opposite. Many times youth don't recognize the skills and the abilities that they do possess because they've gotten caught up in the ones that they don't have that someone else has, and they lose perspective of what they really do bring to the table that's valuable. So again, in an effort to engage them, the first thing I do is I ask them the question, who are they? And I literally leave the room that they're in and go into another room and come back with a stand-up mirror. And I place the mirror in the middle of the room, and I say to the mirror, mirror, mirror that I see, tell me who you see in me. And I'm the guinea pig. I don't mind being the guinea pig. So I start it off, and I look in that mirror and I ask that mirror the question, and then I answer the question as though the mirror were speaking to me. And I tell them what I see in me. And I remind them, I'm not talking about physical attributes that you can see. How tall I am, what color my skin is, what kind of clothes I wear. The mirror is looking inside of me. And again, depending on how big your group is, I want each youth to stand in front of that mirror and repeat the phrase, mirror, mirror that I see, tell me who you see in me. And I force them to dig within themselves. I force them to look inside, not the external, but what really is inside of them that mirror can see. Maybe other people don't see. Maybe they don't even walk in it and live it out, but it's inside of them. And again, it's not about right or wrong answers. It's about how do you respond, and it's about being aware of how others respond about themselves. Because at the end of the day, who I see myself to be is who I will show others. And if I don't see myself to be a particular way, I won't be able to show that to other people. So this is the pop quiz that engages them, that gets their brains to processing, how do I answer the question, who am I? And after we do that with a few of the youth and we have a discussion about it, it's beautiful to watch them recognize that they said some things that they didn't necessarily expect to say. And then after I've had some of them look in the mirror and make the statement and describe themselves, then I ask them, who are they from God's perspective? And I take them back to Genesis. And I remind them that God created man in his own image, period. And I want them to recognize that is what the Bible tells us about who we are. We are created in God's image. And we discuss that. What does that mean to them? Do they believe that? Do they walk in that? Do they think that's true? Do they think that's just ridiculous? But I just want them to discuss the notion that God said in his word, he created us in his own image. And I give them a list of attributes of God. You know, you can find lists of God's attributes in many places. And I give them a list of attributes, including things like affectionate, empathetic, forgiving, kind, loving, patient. And I want them to look at that list and ask themselves, of those items, who is God in their mind, and which of those attributes are most important to them about God? And again, I've got a little puzzle that I want them to put the attributes on this puzzle, because the puzzle describes who God is from their perspective. Again, it's not about right and wrong. It's about what's in your head. What do you believe? What do you think? And I only allow them to give me 6 attributes that are most important to them about God, not in any particular order, just in terms of they are important to them about who God is or isn't. And all these are positive attributes. I don't consider negative attributes, but we discuss that because it always comes up. Well, but I believe that God is judgmental, and I believe that God is a punisher, and I believe that God is wrathful, angry. We discuss that, but those are not the attributes that I want them to consider. And then after we look at that, I slide into the question, what are the attributes of God, since you have been made in his image, that you reflect consistently to others as you live your life? Now, this is not what's important. This is, what are you reflecting? How are you the image bearer of God as you live life with other people? And again, this is a puzzle. And they put those attributes that they consistently reflect in the puzzle so that they can see for themselves, how am I an image bearer? How am I reflecting God or not? The discussion that comes out of these 2 comparisons blew my mind, because I heard comments like, well, I do these things sometimes, but I don't do them consistently. Or the things that are most important to me about God aren't the things that I even think about reflecting in my life to others. And they've got to look at that. They've got to ask themselves, what's up with that? If they truly are made in the image of God and they believe that, then why would they not reflect those characteristics that are most important to them about God and their relationships with other people? And I just want them to think about that and process that and have a discussion among themselves about that and just see what they are able to see. I think, when I think about working with youth this way, I want them to see what they see. I don't want them to necessarily see what I want them to see, even in the sense of, are they created in God's image? I don't necessarily require that they believe that. But if they don't believe that, I want to have a discussion about why not. That's what the Bible says. So what do you believe if you don't believe that? How were you created the way you were created? And then once they're able to look at that, I want them to be able to appreciate the fact that they are fearfully and wonderfully made. I take them to Psalms. I don't want them to doubt that God went, oh, my bad, I messed up on XYZ. Because God doesn't make mistakes. He never goes, my bad, oops. But at the same time, we don't always like the way we're made. And people don't always value and appreciate the way God made us. And we've got to process that. We've got to make sense out of that. And so the discussion that follows takes them to the place where they have to appreciate the fact that whether they value, like, are happy about the way God made them, they must decide whether they believe that God went, oops, my bad, and made a mistake, or whether there's a plan and purpose for exactly the way they were made. And I don't care if that means they were born blind. I don't care if that means they were born with one leg. One of my favorite videos is about a young man who was born with only a partial arm. And the testimony and the ministry that has come out of his life. And so I want them to understand they don't have any excuses, and they don't have to agree or like all that God did in the way he created them, but he did not go, oops, my bad, I made a mistake. So out of that discussion of the comparison between life and video games, and them beginning to answer the question for themselves, who are they? That's the introduction. That's where we start level 1, week 1. And again, it's not about right or wrong answers. It's simply about engaging them, opening them up, and giving them some information to process for themselves. And then realize, what do I see? What do I realize? What is my takeaway from this discussion? So again, there are 2 handouts for these 2 exercises, and I walk them through it, and I generate discussion. I call it a no judgment zone. There is no judgment allowed in these discussions, because I want them to feel free to open up and talk with me and to each other. And then at the end of that session, I ask for takeaways. What do you take away from this session today? What do you realize? What do you see? What do you understand differently? And I say to them, if you don't take anything away from this, then we wasted our time. But I don't care what they take away as long as they take away something, because it's a process. So this is how I begin the youth work to study, surrender, explode, learning to play the game of life God's way. These are only 2 of the exercises in level 1, but these are 2 that I hope will give you a flavor for how I approach it. And as I said to you earlier in the week, each Friday, I'm going to do a demonstration like this, so you have a sense of what the handouts contain, how I approach the handouts, and the discussion that I'm trying to generate with the young people as we walk through this. So remember, if you've got any questions or you need any help, hit me. I will respond. Go back to my website and look at the lesson as I have explained it there. Go back to my YouTube channel. There's more teaching material there as well. But don't need help, don't need assistance that you have not asked for. I will respond, so feel free to reach out to me. So have a great Friday. I hope that you did turn your scales back 15 pounds so that you're in good shape today, no matter how much you weighed yesterday. And I appreciate your commitment to our youth as game changers, because we are going to make a difference. And our youth will not self-destruct because of the challenges they face in the culture. Take care. I'll talk to you again next week. And hit me up if you've got questions. Bye-bye.